This week I found myself in a huge creative rut. I mean, I could still think of things that I wanted to draw, but it felt like every time I put pen to paper, it came out completely differently from what I had in mind. And that's especially frustrating when you're used to just being able to translate what's in your head onto the paper and suddenly it's unrecognizable. So, what I decided to do was just shake things up and get out of my comfort zone and do things that I'm not as familiar with so that I could interrupt that dialogue in my mind that's saying, it's going to look like this, oh, it doesn't look like this, oh, I'm a bad artist, and instead do things that were entirely unpredictable to me. So I started out by doing something pretty simple. You might have done it in some art classes. It's just a contour drawing, not a blind contour drawing, so I'm still looking at the subject, but it's a contour drawing in that I'm just focusing on the outside edges and the shapes of it and nothing to do with the shadows, and I'm not even sketching it out to begin with. I'm just listening to the edges. So I used a big brush pen for this, which I never use. You know, I like my tiny nibs. And I just did a fun floral arrangement that I've had around my house. It was actually really relaxing to let go of how things were going to look and not have any expectations. Next, I switched to a technique I'm a little more comfortable with, which is just cross-hatching in ink. But you can see that I haven't used a pencil. I'm not sketching it out. I'm still doing that contour drawing and looking at the petals and just focusing on the edges. And that's really interesting because, of course, the proportions are going to be off, but I actually think that it responds more to the shape of it because you're listening to those tiny little wrinkles and bumps instead of focusing on the larger form. So, not necessarily the best technique in the long run, but it's good to shake things up and get your eye to focus on something different for a change. Then I decided to work at a larger scale with a very unfamiliar tool. So I took out my biggest graphic Micron. This is not one that I regularly use. In fact, I don't know if I've ever used it before because it has a flat chisel edge to it, so it changes depending on what angle you hold it at. So I found this really difficult with hatching, and I actually struggled a lot through this drawing. And I won't say that I'm happy with the way it turned out, but it certainly got me to think differently, which I think was the whole point of the exercise. It helped me understand some of my weaker points, which sometimes fade into the background when you use a smaller nib. Because when you use such a thick nib, you can't hide any of your mistakes. Then I decided to switch to another medium entirely, which is painting. I don't have a lot of experience with painting, but I've always enjoyed it when I have tried it. So I set up a little still life, and I just went for it. Not much planning in advance. This got me to think about larger blocks of tone and value instead of those little lines that comprise them. So if you're having trouble seeing that, and if you're focusing too much on little mark making, then painting is a great exercise to get out of that rut. Finally, this was my biggest challenge, and it was doing a portrait of myself in the mirror. Now, of course, my eyes look crazy because they're flitting back and forth between the portrait and my actual face, but I struggled most with this because I have a very bad lazy eye. So I was having trouble focusing on the paper and then focusing on my face. And I found myself wanting to put on glasses in the middle of it, but I'd started the drawing already, so I didn't want to mess it up. It became pretty clear to me that I had gotten the proportions wrong. I did the classic mistake of putting the eyes too far up on the face because the tendency is to think the bottom half of the face is much more important because it has all our features than that big forehead and hair. And so I definitely stretched out my face in an odd way, which you can see. But I'm pretty happy with the values, actually. And I think this was a good exercise because it made me look at the real world instead of just a photo. And that's a huge challenge. A photo is something you can pretty reliably copy. Not that that means it doesn't take skill. I mean, that's what I always do, is use photos, and I love using photo references. But working from life, it pushes you so much that when you go back to a photo, it feels like a breeze. So it hasn't been the easiest week creatively. But I'm kind of glad I got into this rut because it forced me to do all these different techniques and mediums that I wouldn't usually try. And that opened up my mind to different possibilities in art, and it also lowered my expectations for myself. So I hope you can get some value from this and try to shake things up in your own practice.